while, while visiting my wife at the hospital. The front desk told me, "Are you aware she passed away 3 days ago?" "What do you mean? We were just texting this morning." I fumbled for my phone to show her the messages. The elderly receptionist adjusted her glasses and looked at me with a mixture of confusion and pity. She turned her computer monitor toward me and pointed at the screen. There it was in black and white. Leah Hartman, date of death January 15th, 3:44 a.m. Today was January 18th. I stared at the monitor while my brain tried to process. Just 2 hours ago, Leah had texted asking me to bring her favorite shampoo because the hospital stuff was drying out her hair. Yesterday she'd complained about missing our cat. The day before she'd sent me a selfie with her breakfast tray making a disgusted face at the scrambled eggs. The receptionist was saying something about protocol and notification procedures, but I couldn't focus on her words. My legs moved on their own toward the elevator. She called after me, but I was already running. 3rd floor, room 312. Security guards appeared from nowhere as I burst out of the elevator. They shouted for me to stop, but I kept running down the familiar hallway past the nurses' station where I'd asked about visiting hours so many times, past the vending machine where I'd bought her ginger ale for her nausea. My work boots squeaked on the polished floor as I skidded around the corner. Room 312's door was wide open. Inside, a young nurse aide was stripping sheets from the bed. The antiseptic smell of industrial cleaner filled my nostrils. All the cards I'd brought her were gone. The teddy bear from her sister, her phone charger, even the whiteboard where nurses wrote their names had been wiped clean. The security guards caught up and grabbed my arms, but gently. They could see I wasn't a threat, just a confused husband whose world was crumbling. The nurse aide explained that the room had been sanitized 2 days ago following standard procedure. A new patient would be admitted tomorrow. One guard led me to a quiet room while the other made phone calls. That's when I learned the truth. Leah had died alone at 3:44 a.m. on January 15th. Her brother Kevin was supposed to be with her that night. I'd been working my second job at the warehouse to cover the mounting medical bills. Kevin had promised to stay with her whenever I couldn't be there. I'd been sending him money every few days, for parking, for food, for a nearby hotel so he wouldn't have to drive home. Leah would text me what she needed, and I'd transfer it to Kevin immediately. $50 here, $100 there, whatever it took to make sure she wasn't alone, and had everything she needed. The hospital administrator who joined us was kind but professional. She showed me the paperwork. Kevin had been listed as present at time of death, but several nurses noted they hadn't actually seen him that night. He'd signed out at 11 p.m. claiming he'd be right back. Leah died nearly 5 hours later with no family present. My phone buzzed. Another text from Leah's number popped up on the screen. "Feeling a lot better? Can I have $300 for my medication?" My eyes went wide as I texted back, "Kevin, is this you?" 3 dots appeared immediately, showing he was typing, and then his response popped up on the screen. "You don't understand what I went through, watching her suffer every day while you were at work making money." The administrator leaned over my shoulder and saw the message and told me to save everything and keep him talking. My fingers shook as I typed back asking where he was, and another text came through saying I had no idea how hard it was for him to be there every night, watching his sister die slowly. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, but instead I screenshot the conversation while the administrator watched and nodded. She asked if I knew where Leah's belongings were since the room had been cleared, and I told her Kevin must have them since he was listed as next of kin. That night, the administrator picked up her desk phone and called security, asking about the chain of custody for patient personal effects from room 312. She listened for a minute, then wrote something on a notepad and hung up. Security confirmed Kevin signed for all of Leah's belongings the morning of January 16th at 7:23 a.m., which was Less than 4 hours after she died, my phone kept buzzing with more messages from Kevin saying I was being selfish and didn't understand family loyalty, and that he'd tell everyone how I abandoned Leah from my job if I kept asking questions. Each text got more aggressive, and I screenshot them all, while my hands trembled with rage that made it hard to hold the phone steady. The administrator saw my reaction and put her hand on my arm, telling me this was good evidence and to let him keep incriminating himself. She made another call to security asking if they had camera footage from the night Leah died, and after a short conversation, she hung up and told me to follow her. We walked down a long hallway to the security office where a guard was already pulling up video files on his computer. The timestamp showed 11:07 p.m. on January 14th, and there was Kevin walking out the main entrance carrying a backpack and what looked like a plastic bag. The guard fast-forwarded through the footage, but Kevin never came back that night, and the timestamp kept running until 4:15 a.m., which was 30 minutes after Leah died alone in that room. My stomach turned, knowing she spent her last hours wondering where everyone was, while Kevin was probably already home, asleep. The administrator printed screenshots of the footage and made notes about the timeline while I stood there trying not to vomit from the anger and grief mixing in my gut. Back in her office, she gave me copies of everything and said I should contact the police about the fraud and suggested I also reach out to their patient advocacy department. I thanked her and walked out to the parking lot where I sat in my car for 10 minutes before remembering I hadn't shown up for my warehouse shifts in 3 days. I called Bill Conrad, my supervisor, and his gruff voice answered on the second ring, asking where the hell I'd been. I explained everything that just happened, and he went quiet for a long moment before telling me to take the week to sort this mess out, and my job would be waiting when I got back. Relief washed over me, knowing I wouldn't lose my income on top of everything else happening right now. The administrator had given me a business card for someone named Nicole Lambert in patient advocacy. So I called the number and got her voicemail. I left a message explaining the situation with Kevin and the fake texts and asked her to call me back as soon as possible. 20 minutes later, while I was driving home, Nicole called back and said she'd reviewed my wife's file after getting my message, and this wasn't the first time she'd seen family members exploit a death for money. She asked if I could come to her office tomorrow morning to go over everything and start documenting a case for potential legal action. I agreed, and she gave me the address for the patient advocacy office on the second floor of the medical building, next to the main hospital. That evening, I sat at our kitchen table with 3 months of bank statements spread out in front of me and started adding up every transfer I'd sent to Kevin. $50 on December 28th for parking and food, $75 on January 2nd for a hotel room, 100% on January 5th for gas and meals, another $100 on January 8th, $50 on January 10th, $150 on January 12th when he said the hotel raised their rates, 75% on January 14th, which was the night he abandoned her. The total came to over $2,000, and that was just what I could find in the statements. Our cat jumped on the table and walked over to Leah's empty chair where she always sat for dinner and meowed, looking around for her. My chest got tight and I had to push the papers away and walk to the living room where her knitting basket still sat next to the couch with a half-finished scarf she'd been making before she got sick. I picked up my phone and called Kevin's number directly, but it went straight to voicemail after one ring, which meant he was declining my calls. I left a message telling him I knew what he did and demanding he return Leah's phone and belongings immediately or I'd involve the police. My voice cracked when I said Leah died alone because of him and that he'd betrayed both of us for money. First hung up and immediately got a text from him saying I was harassing him and he'd get a restraining order if I didn't stop. The next morning, Nicole Lambert called at 8 a.m. sharp asking if I could bring all my documentation to our meeting. She said she'd already pulled the hospital's records showing Kevin's early departure and had statements from 2 nurses who noted they never saw him. After 11 p.m. she explained that impersonating a deceased person for financial gain was a serious crime and, with the evidence we had, the police would likely take this seriously. At the police station that afternoon, the desk officer barely looked up when I started explaining why I was there. He seemed ready to brush me off until I pulled out my phone and showed him the text asking for $300 that came after the timestamp on Leah's death certificate. His whole expression changed and he stood up, telling me to wait right there while he got a detective. Riordan walked in, carrying a thick folder and a digital recorder, and sat down across from me with the kind of serious expression that made my stomach drop. He spread out printed screenshots of the text messages from after Leah's death and pointed to specific timestamps showing they came from Kevin's apartment address according to the phone carrier data. The evidence was overwhelming, but he warned me these cases move slowly through the system and Kevin would probably get a plea deal rather than jail time. That same afternoon my phone started ringing non-stop with calls from Leah's cousins and aunts asking if it was true what Kevin was saying about me trying to frame him for stealing. He'd been calling everyone in the family with his soba story about how I was grief-stricken and looking for someone to blame, and now I had to defend myself to people who should have been supporting me. Most of them didn't buy his version once I explained about the texts from Leah's phone after she died, but the damage was done and family gatherings would never be the same. Nicole called me the next morning saying she could help me put together a timeline document with all the evidence so family members could see the facts for themselves without me having to explain it over and over. We met at her office and spent 3 hours organizing death certificates and phone records and bank statements into a clear sequence that showed exactly what Kevin did and when he did it. She photocopied everything and made a digital version I could email to anyone who asked for the truth instead of getting dragged into arguments about Kevin's lies. While we were working, Elsie from the phone company called with new information that made my blood boil even more. Kevin had tried to add himself as an authorized user on Leah's account 2 days after she died using her social security number and birth date, which he must have gotten from her hospital paperwork. The attempt failed because the account was flagged for the death notification, but it showed this wasn't just grief or confusion but calculated fraud from the start. I had to go back to work eventually since bills don't stop coming just because your world falls apart. Bill rearranged the schedule so I could work day shifts instead of overnights, which helped since I couldn't handle being awake all night anymore thinking about Leah dying alone in that hospital room. The warehouse guys were awkward around me at first, not knowing what to say, but eventually things settled into a new normal where I could focus on loading trucks without breaking down every hour. Detective Riordan called me a week later after interviewing Kevin formally at the station. Kevin admitted to having Leah's phone but claimed she gave it to him before she died, which made no sense since the nurses confirmed she was unconscious for her last 12 hours. The detective said Kevin got defensive and started yelling about being persecuted for grieving his sister, but the evidence was clear, and the case would move forward to the prosecutor's office. I found a legal aid attorney through a nonprofit that helps crime victims, and she reviewed everything with brutal honesty. Criminal prosecution was a long shot since Kevin could claim confusion or grief as a defense, but civil court might work better for getting restitution, though even that would take months and cost money I didn't have. She filed the paperwork anyway and said sometimes just having a lawsuit pending makes people more willing to negotiate. Out of nowhere I got a Facebook message from someone named Jessica who said she was Kevin's girlfriend and needed to talk to me urgently. We met at a coffee shop where she told me she'd been dating Kevin for 6 months and just found out about everything when the police contacted her. She looked sick as she explained Kevin had been borrowing money from her too, claiming it was for Leah's medical expenses, but now she Realized he'd been using it for online poker sites. She showed me screenshots from his laptop showing thousands in gambling debts to sketchy websites, which explained why he was so desperate for money he'd steal from his dead sister's husband. The memorial service was scheduled for 3 weeks after Leah's death, and of course, Kevin insisted on attending even though half the family didn't want him there after learning what he did. I had to hire an off-duty cop to provide security just to keep things peaceful while still letting him say goodbye to his sister, since legally I couldn't ban him from a public funeral home. During the service, Kevin got up to speak and started crying so hard he couldn't get words out and collapsed back into his chair. Whether it was real grief for Leah or self-pity for getting caught, I couldn't tell, but seeing him there made me realize he'd destroyed not just our relationship but his connection to Leah's memory forever. Mahmoud from my bank called the next day, saying we needed to set up better protections on all accounts immediately. He helped me freeze Leah's accounts and set up fraud alerts and password changes on everything to prevent any more exploitation, even though the damage was already done, and the money Kevin stole was probably gone forever, spent on poker sites and who knows what else. Detective Rearan called 3 weeks later asking me to meet him at the district attorney's office downtown. I took the morning off work and drove there in my beat-up truck, still wearing my warehouse uniform since I had to go straight back. After, the prosecutor's office was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old paper and floor wax. Detective Rearan was waiting in the lobby with a thick folder under his arm. He led me to a small conference room where a young prosecutor was already sitting with her own stack of papers spread across the table. She introduced herself, but I forgot her name immediately because my mind was focused on what she was saying about Kevin's case. She explained they could charge him with fraud and identity theft based on the evidence, but warned me that most cases like this end in plea deals. The defendant agrees to probation and some small amount of restitution to avoid trial. She said, trials are expensive and risky, and juries sometimes feel sorry for grieving family members even when they've done wrong things. Detective Rearan nodded along, but I could see in his face he wasn't happy about it either. They'd do their best, but I shouldn't expect Kevin to serve real jail time. I left that meeting feeling like the legal system was just another disappointment added to the pile. The next Tuesday I forced myself to go to a grief support group at the hospital. Nicole had suggested it weeks ago, but I'd been putting it off because talking about feelings with strangers seemed pointless. The group met in a basement room with folding chairs, arranged in a circle and a coffee pot gurgling in the corner. There were 8 other people there, all at different stages of loss. The facilitator was a soft-spoken woman who'd lost her own husband 5 years earlier. As we went around the circle sharing our stories, I realized 3 others had dealt with family members who'd stolen or lied during their loved one's illness. One woman's sister had cleaned out their mother's bank account while she was in hospice. A man's brother had sold their father's car and tools before he was even buried. Hearing their stories made me feel less crazy for being angry at Kevin on top of grieving Leah. We met every Tuesday, and slowly I started looking forward to it, even though it meant reliving the pain each week. Nicole called me that Friday with news about help for the medical bills. She'd connected me with a social worker named Caitlin who specialized in medical debt. Caitlin came to my apartment the next day with a briefcase full of forms and spent 3 hours going through every bill and insurance statement. She found errors where the hospital had double billed for some procedures and insurance claims that hadn't been processed right. We applied for 5 different hardship programs and she negotiated payment plans that dropped my monthly obligation from impossible to just barely manageable. She warned me it would take months to sort everything out, but at least there was a path forward that didn't end in bankruptcy. 2 days later, I got a certified letter from an attorney representing Kevin. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting some kind of legal threat. Instead, it was an offer to return some of Leah's belongings in exchange for me dropping the criminal charges. The letter listed her jewelry box, some photos, and a few other personal items, but made no mention of the money he'd stolen or her phone. I wanted to tear it up and throw it away, but I needed those things back. They were all I had left of her besides memories. I called my legal aid attorney, who said I couldn't actually drop charges since the state was prosecuting, but I could write a letter saying I wouldn't push for maximum penalties. She thought Kevin's lawyer was probably laying groundwork for a plea negotiation. We scheduled a meeting at Kevin's attorney's office for the following Monday. I barely slept the night before thinking about seeing him again. The attorney's office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparer. Kevin was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner chair looking at his phone. He'd lost weight and his clothes hung loose on his frame. His attorney did all the talking, while Kevin stared at the floor. The attorney pushed a cardboard box across the table toward me. I opened it to find Leah's jewelry box with her grandmother's ring still inside, a stack of photos from our wedding and vacations, her favorite sweater that still smelled faintly of her perfume, and her reading glasses. I wanted to scream at Kevin to look at me to explain how he could do this, but I just took the box and left without saying a word. That night, I went through everything slowly. At the bottom of the jewelry box, I found Leah's journal that she'd kept during her treatments. I'd never known she was writing in it. The entries started hopeful, talking about beating the cancer and coming home, but as weeks passed, they got darker. She wrote about being scared at night when no one was there. She wondered if Kevin was really staying with her like he promised me. The last entry was 3 days before she died and just said she felt so alone. I threw the journal across the room and punched a hole in the wall that I still haven't fixed. The district attorney's office called a week later with their decision. They were charging Kevin with 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of identity theft, but not abandonment or any charges related to leaving Leah alone. The prosecutor explained abandonment was too hard to prove legally, even though we all knew what he'd done. At least the fraud charges were solid with all the evidence we'd gathered. Elsie from the phone company sent me one final report that made everything worse. She'd found evidence that Kevin had deleted dozens of Leah's real text messages from her phone before he started impersonating her. Those were her actual last words to me, and he'd destroyed them forever just to cover his tracks. I'll never know what she really wanted to tell me in those final days. I took a full week off work to sort through Leah's things and make memory boxes for family members. Bill was understanding and even paid me for 3 of the days, which helped. I separated photos into albums for her sister and cousins, packed her books to donate to the hospital library, and kept her favorite things for myself. The process was exhausting, but it helped to focus on celebrating who she was instead of obsessing over how she died and what Kevin did. On Friday afternoon, my legal aid attorney called with news. Kevin had agreed to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for 3 years, probation, and $500 in restitution. $500 when he'd stolen over $2,000. She said it was probably the best we could get since he had no criminal record and could claim grief and confusion as mitigating factors. The judge would have to approve it, but these deals usually go through. I hung up feeling defeated again, but also tired of fighting. Maybe it was better to just let it end, even if the ending wasn't fair. 3 weeks later, I sat in the courtroom waiting for Kevin's sentencing hearing to start. The room smelled like old wood and floor polish. My hands were sweating as I held the paper with my victim impact statement. The prosecutor had helped me write it, but the words were mine. Kevin sat at the defense table in a cheap suit that looked borrowed. He kept his eyes down on his folded hands. When the judge called me forward, my legs felt weak, but I made myself walk to the podium. I read about losing Leah twice, first when she died, and then when I found out she died alone because Kevin left her. My voice cracked when I described finding those last journal entries where she wrote about being scared. The judge watched me the whole time and nodded. When I finished, Kevin's attorney spoke, next about his client's grief and poor judgment. The judge cut him off halfway, through, and said she'd heard enough. She followed the plea agreement, but her voice was sharp when she ordered Kevin to pay $500 in monthly installments of $50. She also ordered no contact with me for 3 years and told him any violation would mean jail time. Kevin stood and mumbled something that was supposed to be an apology. His attorney had clearly told him to say it because he read from a note card without looking up once. The bailiff let him out to process his probation paperwork. I left through a different door and threw up in the courthouse bathroom. The next week, I started seeing a therapist who specialized in complicated grief. Her office had soft chairs and tissue boxes on every surface. She explained that losing someone to illness was hard enough, but having it mixed with betrayal made everything more complex. We talked about how my anger at Kevin was completely valid. She helped me see that being mad didn't make me a bad person. She also warned me not to let the anger eat me alive from the inside. We made a plan to work through both the grief and the betrayal separately. Some days we focused on missing Leah, and other days we dealt with what Kevin did. 6 weeks after Leah died, I had my first quiet evening that didn't feel like drowning. I was folding laundry when I realized I wasn't crying. The cat jumped up on the bed and curled up on Leah's old sweater that I couldn't bring myself to wash yet. I sat there petting him, and remembered our first date when Leah spilled coffee on herself and laughed so hard she snorted. For once, the memory didn't immediately lead to thinking about Kevin or the hospital. It was just a good memory of my wife. The moment passed, but it gave me hope that maybe someday I could think of her without the pain crushing me. Bill called me into his office on a Monday morning. I thought I was in trouble for all the time I'd missed. Instead, he told me he was promoting me to supervisor on the day shift. He said I'd proven myself reliable even through everything that happened. The raise would help with the medical bills that kept coming. Having normal work hours meant I could sleep at night instead of working myself to exhaustion. It also meant I could keep my therapy appointments without juggling schedules. I thanked him and he just nodded and said to start training my replacement on nights. Nicole Lambert started calling every few weeks to check on me. She didn't have to since her official role was done, but she seemed to actually care. She told me about a program for fraud victims that might help recover some money. She sent me the application and helped me fill it out over the phone. She also connected me with a financial counselor who worked with medical debt. Nicole said she'd seen too many families destroyed by medical bills on top of grief. She wanted to make sure I had support even after the criminal case ended. The first restitution check came 6 weeks after sentencing. $50 that felt like an insult. After everything Kevin took, I stared at it for a long time before depositing it. I opened a separate account just for these payments. Every penny would go toward Leah's headstone, which I still couldn't afford. At least something good would come from his debt, even if it took 10 months to pay for the stone. Leah's sister called about holding another memorial on what would have been Leah's birthday. This time we made it clear Kevin wasn't welcome. We met at Leah's favorite restaurant and shared stories. Her cousin brought photo albums from when they were kids. Her best friend from college flew in from Denver. We laughed at old pictures and cried when someone mentioned how much she would have loved seeing everyone together. Nobody mentioned Kevin or how she died. We just celebrated who she was, the grief support group leader. asked if I'd share my story with new members. I wasn't ready at first, but she said it might help someone else. The next meeting I stood up and told them everything. A woman whose husband died, while her sister was stealing from them. Started crying. She said she thought she was the only one dealing with family betrayal on top of grief. After the meeting, 3 people thanked me for being honest about the anger part. They said everyone talked about sadness, but nobody admitted how mad they were. Detective Rearon called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work. He said Kevin had violated his probation already. He'd made a fake social media account and tried to friend request me. The profile used a different name, but the email linked back to him. His probation officer was handling it, but the detective wanted me to know in case. Kevin tried other ways to contact me. He said guys like Kevin never learned from consequences. They just got sneakier about breaking rules. I thanked him and changed all my privacy settings to the highest level. 2 weeks later, I started looking at apartments closer to work. The realtor showed me 3 places in one afternoon, and the second one felt right. It was half the size of our old place, but the rent was manageable on just my salary. I signed the lease that same day. Packing took longer than I expected. Every drawer had something of Leah's tucked inside. Her reading glasses in the kitchen junk drawer, hair ties scattered everywhere, a grocery list in her handwriting stuck to the back of a takeout menu. I kept filling boxes, then sitting on the floor going through them again. The important stuff went in one pile. Her jewelry box with the necklace I gave her for our anniversary, photo albums from our trips, the sweater she wore all the time that still smelled like her perfume. Everything else went to donation boxes. Her old magazines, kitchen gadgets she bought but never used, clothes that hadn't fit her in years. The movers came on a Saturday morning and had everything loaded in 2 hours. The cat hid under the bathroom sink until they left. At the new place, I set up her photos on a shelf in the living room where I could see them every day. Elsie from the phone company called me the next week with an idea. She could set up a memorial line that would play Leah's voicemail greeting when I called it. The number would be different from the one Kevin had used for his scam. She walked me through the setup over the phone while I sat at my new kitchen table. We transferred the greeting from the old account before shutting it down completely. Now, when I needed to hear her voice, I could call without thinking about those fake texts. She sounded happy in the recording, telling callers she'd get back to them soon. 8 months passed before I felt stable enough